Welcome to another one of my Sadler's Honest Book Reviews, in which I look at literature dealing with philosophy, ethics, leadership, self-help, and life generally. Today I'm going to be talking about a book that's new, but isn't really new. It's How to Die, An Ancient Guide to the End of Life, which is by Seneca, but edited, translated, and introduced by James S. Romm, and published by Princeton University Press. This is a set of selections from Seneca that all have to do with death, and I recommend it. I think that anybody who wants to have those passages that are particularly oriented towards thinking about the nature of death and its importance for us as human beings could benefit from having this. I always like to begin by talking about three S's, that is the style of the work, the structure, and giving a brief summary. And I'm going to do that last one first here. So as I mentioned, this is a set of selections, and they're all focused on the theme of death. So to summarize it, this is Seneca talking about something that he underwent. As a matter of fact, it ends talking about Seneca's own death, unfortunately having to kill himself at the command of the Emperor Nero. And it's a topic that, of course, all of us are going to have to face at one time or another. So that's a good segue then into talking about the second one, which is the structure of the work. And this is a fairly short book. Altogether, it is just 229 pages, but, small pages. And there are 5 main sections to the book, not including the materials at the end. Each of them is a chapter consisting of a number of different passages from Seneca, some of them very short, some of them quite long, each of them with a little bit of introductory material by the editor and translator of this work. So there's 5 sections. The first is Prepare Yourself for, of course, dying. The second, Have No Fear. The third, Have No Regrets. The fourth, Set Yourself Free. The fifth, Become Part of the Whole. And then there's an epilogue, Practice What You Preach. And then, I mentioned that the book itself is, over 200 pages long, but the book really only runs to page 122, because after that it's the Latin texts and the notes, which I think some of the readers may be interested in the notes. Very few readers are actually going to look at the Latin texts, but I suppose it's nice to have them in there. There is a good introduction at the start by the editor and translator. He gives a bio of Seneca. If you haven't, encountered that already, that's useful to have. He talks a little bit about Seneca and Stoicism and does a bit of compare-contrast between Seneca and the other Stoics. So I think that material is quite useful as well. When it comes to style, we're talking about a translation. And so I think it's probably good to say this is a very readable translation. I think this will be quite useful for the average person encountering Seneca. You are getting, short snippets, so you're not getting full discussions on the part of Seneca, but it's trying to zero in on some of the main ideas. So what are the main ideas of the work? Again, this is Seneca, so we're getting Seneca's key ideas with respect to dying and with respect to how we ought to live in relation to death. One of the key themes is that death is ultimately unavoidable. And you might say, well, that's a no-brainer. Who needs a book to know that? It's something that we often do forget. Death and dissolution is inevitable for all things, whether we're talking about human beings or our surroundings, any of the books we might pick. They're all going to die in their own way. So that's one key theme. Another that's being treated in the second section is that death is not the evil that we typically not just think it to be, but fear it to be. And the Stoics spent a lot of time talking about how to properly understand death and how to approach it emotionally. So that is another thing that Seneca is going to talk about. Another key theme is that if we think about death and we do so in a very realistic way, without allowing our emotions to overtake us, without buying into cultural assumptions that might be rather questionable, but instead putting them to the test and analyzing them, we can live our lives in a better way. So you could see this as, in some respects, not just about how not to feel bad about death, but how to live well. It's how to die, but the subtitle, An Ancient Guide to the End of Life. But it could be about the rest of our life as well, because we don't know when we're going to die. We don't know what the end of our life is unless, we're being executed or have some sort of disease that leads to that. Another key idea that is particularly interesting, given Seneca's own history, is that death is an escape. And it's an escape from what becomes intolerable for a rational being, which could include being bossed around by a tyrant, which is in fact the case for poor Seneca dealing with Nero. He was an advisor to Nero, tried to keep him on a straight track, was very unsuccessful in doing so. There's also a really good discussion about whether suicide is legitimate or not. The Stoics, I won't say had mixed feelings about this, but they didn't see every single suicide as legitimate. But they did think that somebody like Cato, who is not that long before Seneca, legitimately committed suicide. So there's some interesting discussion of that. And I'm actually going to read you one little passage from the text that brings a few of these themes together. Again, this is Seneca's own words. It's not death that's glorious, but dying courageously. Nobody praises death. Rather, we praise the person whose soul death stripped away before causing it any turmoil. The death that was glorious in Cato's case was base and worthy of shame in Decamus's. This is Decamus, the man who, while seeking postponement of death, though destined to die, drew apart in order to empty his bowels, and when summoned to his death, in order to bare his neck, said, "I'll bear it if I can live." What madness to take flight when there's no going backward. I'll bear it if I can live. He almost added, even under Antony. That's a man worthy to be allowed to live all right, he says. So he says, as I was discussing earlier, see that death in itself is neither good nor bad. Cato made the most honorable use of it, Decamus the most shameful. So the idea here is that suicide and death in general is what we make of it. And that is another key idea of the Stoics that Seneca discusses at great length. Something else that the editor brings out that I think is quite interesting, I hadn't thought about this beforehand, is that Seneca himself, more than the other Stoics, really does talk about death, really focuses on it. And you might say, well, maybe that's a function of the time that he lived in, under these despots who are Caesars, quite arbitrary and capricious, all sorts of shenanigans going on. There's a possibility to that. I don't know that there was less of that going on in Epictetus's world or in Marcus Aurelius's or in any of the other Stoics that we might run across, at least in part. But it is clearly the case that Seneca did a lot more writing about it, not necessarily more thinking, but a lot more writing than many of the other Stoics. So I think that's a great point that Romm is making here. What are the good points about this work? I think there's quite a few, and I'm happy to say what they are. The first is that this is going to be a really good intro for somebody who hasn't read Seneca, but is interested in Stoic philosophy. And I think it's a great theme. It'll help people, at least if they don't agree with Seneca and put things in perspective in a Stoic way, they can at least see what the Stoics had to say, including this major Stoic thinker, about the condition that we're all in and the inevitable death that we must face. So it's a good intro for Seneca's work. It's definitely by somebody who knows Seneca's work inside and out. I was, very happy to read the translations. I think they really are quite excellent. They're going to be very readable for the modern person. There's not a lot of these and thouing in there or anything along those lines. It's organized, I think, in a very useful way. These 5 chapters, bringing together these passages, quite a good way to do it. He could have touched on more, but then it would have been a longer book, and maybe this is exactly the right sort of length for the English portion of the book. And the last thing that I'll say that I really do like about it is when you're excerpting from an author, it's very difficult to decide what to include and what to leave out. And the tendency is always to try to pack as much in as possible. Romm has selected, I think, some of the best passages for conveying Seneca's own views. Now, there's more to Seneca, of course, than is in here, but you can always go to the other works. Read the whole letters, or read, the Consolations, or read whatever you want, the various treatises by Seneca. But this is going to provide you with an excellent entry point into thinking about it. And it's nice the way that these are gathered together. So that you can think primarily about this issue of death. The only negative thing that I do have to say about this work, there's always some sort of fly in the ointment, isn't there, is interestingly something that I imagine many readers are going to see as a positive, and that's the Latin texts that are included. Because if you look at the book, this much of it is Latin texts, and so it could have been a much thinner volume. I don't think that adding the Latin text at the end really does any good. It's not as if scholars are going to go through this and say, I'm going to check his translation, I better go to the Latin. It's not particularly convenient because it's not facing pages. You got to go back and forth. And the ordinary person, are they going to be reading the Latin? I highly doubt it. So, it just added some pages and made the book a bit thicker, so it won't fit so nicely, say, in your back pocket. But that's a very minor quibble, isn't it, with a book that otherwise is quite good. So, to sum up, do I recommend this work? Definitely. And I think this is a great entry point for anybody who hasn't read Seneca. It's going to be, like I mentioned, a very readable translation and collection of his stuff. You're not going to find anything in here that's not in other texts that are available, but it's bringing together these discussions about death. So if you're interested in that particular topic, I think this book is for you.